All right. Hello, my name is Farah Lawal Harris. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the artistic director of Young Playwrights Theater. And I'm also having the pleasure of facilitating this conversation with playwright Tom Minter. To the audience. Awesome. And we also have your director, Angelisa Gilliard. Angelisa, can you introduce yourself?
I am Angelisa Gilliard. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a freelance director and choreographer in the Washington, D.C. area.
All right, thank you both, and thank you everyone who's tuning in. So we are discussing some of the themes involved with By Me by Tom Minter. And what is going to happen is you'll see this discussion and you'll see a couple of scenes from the play, and then you'll come back to us having another discussion. So one of the themes that pops up in the play is the weight of legacy and caste as it affects Black folks. And I was wondering, Tom, just what you wanted to speak to when you chose that as one of the themes of your play.
I thought it would be easy since I know how this is going to be framed just to get in and have a conversation. I've always wanted to write a play that talked from a personal experience of color and dynamics of caste and class in a family. And I never came to that play until this moment in time, late in my life. And it's come because I've reflected out of my own experiences in my own family, across conversations at table and across conversations that you take in one manner at one point in your life, but then when you start reflecting on how you're shaped by what you hear and what comes out of family, how it resonates differently in this period of time of looking at many of the challenges for conversation about what exactly is the weight of legacy for Black families. For me, it was, while there could be conversations of color coding and caste, C-A-S-T-E, and class, they were never framed as such. It was this fabric that was part of the family, and we knew where our place was in all of these conversations that we would have that would kind of suggest all the otherness that we are not. And I found that really interesting that we don't speak about it. I found it interesting that my family didn't speak about it specifically. And as a playwright, I find what people don't articulate says so much about how they bring in the world to themselves and how they speak to others in the world who are not them or do not come from them. So
thank you for that. Thank you. Now, Angelisa, you're coming into this process later.
Well, it's interesting because I really did feel like I knew these characters, or at least knew people who were like them. They were very real to me and spoke to me. And I do feel like in a lot of families, for Black people, you either go to the extreme of the unspoken or the extreme of, everything is kind of spoken about in terms of who is appropriate for you to marry or be with, where is it appropriate for you to, go to school, get, have a career, like that type of thing. So for me, when I read the play, it was extremely familiar in terms of being in the family where certain things were spoken about, but not other things. Because, I love my family dearly, but there were subtle hints about, what to do, what not to do, where to go, where not to go, type of thing. So it really did hit me in a very familiar kind of place.
Similarly to me, it's interesting how this play is written from an African-American perspective. And for me, I am an African-American by definition, but I'm a first-generation Nigerian. So even though the family background was very different, there were some similarities that still come across, especially the weight of the undiscussed and also the weight of the bougie, which is something that you all as audience members will hear about shortly when you see the excerpts from the play. And Tom, did you realize that like those themes were going to speak across the diaspora, not just for Black Americans, but for Black folks from just different parts of the world?
I had hoped it might, but I had no forethought about how it would resonate. I specifically did not want to preach. I did not want to accuse. I did not want to antagonize. I didn't want to sensationalize. And I didn't want to put any of the conversations in this piece in a place that was demeaning or inappropriate, whereby an audience could not really hear the point that I'm trying to make, or the conversations and threads that I'm really trying to spool out so that we can look at them. In the play, which the excerpt is from, is the curated version of the full-length play. And the curated version is 3 frames by me. And it quite succinctly speaks to color, class, and caste. And in the 2 scenes, there'll be conversations of both those dynamic. But the play itself, as it came about, there was an organic process of finding quotes by African-American leaders and thought people of great thought, that would frame the scenes and give us some sense of historical context for why people were acting the way they were acting, which is really a very deep subtext to me, for how certainly my family lived its life and lives its life, that there are certain things that you do because, we know that we don't do them in those such way. And that kind of thing is never really articulated. But if you look back at where we take subtle construct from, I felt that continues to inform class structure and negotiation of caste in Black families, and certainly in mine.
Sure. I'm curious of an example of one of those things. Like if each of us have an example of what are those things that we were told that we should not do based on just the position of our families. Is that too personal?
Oh yeah, it is. It's definitely too personal.
How about this? How about things that either you should do or you should not do? So pick one. And I myself don't even know what I'm about to say. I might be digging too deep myself, but I think it is interesting because this play, especially when I was reading the script, it really spoke to me, this section of this is a side of my Africanness that I don't feel comfortable discussing because it others me in a way that's uncomfortable amongst my peers, and yeah, it's just something that I'm curious about, just with how the specificity of those messages that we're told influence how we interpret this work.
I'll give an example. So in my family, education is queen or king. And there were zero options given about whether or not I would go to college. Like from a very, very young age, you're going to college. Like that was the message that I got. And even grad school, my dad was like, yes, you can start dating after you get your PhD, So it was always education is the thing, you must go to school. The thought of doing something different where I did not go to school was not even ever considered. So.
Yeah, similar. I had that as well. Tom, did you want to go next or did you want me to say?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, education was definitely a thing. I think the overarching message is that you will not disgrace this family, whether that meant getting pregnant as a teenager, you will not embarrass us. Acting out at school or being seen in a place where I'm not supposed to be seen or hanging out with people I'm not supposed to be with, but anything that would make our family look bad on our community because of my poor decision making, or what would be considered poor by the standards of Nigerian people, and specifically Yoruba people, because that's its own microcosm of culture. So those things have to do with how I carry myself as a woman, the type of company I keep, who I date, and if I am dating that person, do my parents know that I'm dating this person? Because that itself could be a disgrace. So yeah, I think that was the overarching message of we have to maintain our positive image in our community, because that image has already been positive before we were even born, and we can't ruin the legacy of the people who came before us. Yeah. How about you, Tom?
For me, it too very much skewed along that way. I mean, we have to reinforce the appropriate image for a person of color, especially out in public. But I felt it later in life as this incredible nuance of what exact kind of person of color out in public we were meant to be. I mean, there were often inferences that would differentiate what we would do from what other people would do. And that was such a continuum in the background of conversation that I also recognized was not articulated by anybody else around us in public. If we were at the dinner table, or if we were at a family gathering, that would be a really free-ranging conversation, and people could just be as bold and frank as they wanted to be. But it was quite clear, because this was only held at certain times and constructed in quiet and specific to how to dress and how to speak and where to walk, and thinking about education. It was never thinking about education. You will go to college, and then you will go to graduate school, and then you may take a year off, maybe, and then you will get your doctorate. I mean, those kinds of prescriptions were very undiscussed. They were just supposed to be fait accompli. This is what we're going to do. This is, of course, what you're going to do. And I found the more I struggled, struggle is the wrong word, the more I articulated who I was as an individual, being a man of color, gay, who had traveled around in the world beyond just staying in one place, the more I had to unencumber myself, or the more I felt the rub of the encumbrances of the undiscussed as fit fodder for conversation within my own family, which seemed bizarre, but just affirmed how tightly knit these conversations seem to be to identity, and placing identity of a particular kind of Black, of a very special kind of Black. I don't give anything away, but it comes in the conversation that we're going to hear between Ken and his mentor, his theater godmother, Jerry.
That's something else that we could address in the length that this play would be and still be talking about it. So
Exactly.
I encourage folks who are unaware of issues of colorism, not just in Black society, but globally, to look that up and look into it, because it might impact how you are interacting with people around you, and you might not realize that those factors are at play. Well, we hope that you enjoy the two scenes that you're about to watch, and we look forward to talking afterwards with you virtually, kind of, even though it's not live, but we'll be here talking. So stay tuned, and we will see you again shortly. Thank you.
In New York, Jerry's apartment.
You're always so dependably on time.
After years unexpected.
Exactly, when a good theater godmother anticipates offering things to, ooh, who is still with journal.
In memorializing.
The deeper voice of things.
As I was learned.
As you should, always. Though some things will never come truly into focus, not even from the vantage of here.
Such as,
Why is that woman calling me now?
who?
Yours?
Rhea. Or she does, what does she want?
Oh, I have not been home to her calls.
Okay.
I enjoy many friendships, you understand? Lovely continuances out of mutual pasts. You and I, you see, having had a chance to know you, professionally grow you, as it were, into this fine, willing, creative person who I expected, I have no need to diminish that privacy.
No, me too. We are where we would usually sit, at the round marble top table beneath the eaves of her 57th Street library study loft. Left and right of us in processional round the living room wall space. Framed friezes of art, Romare Bearden collages, watercolor, poignant, exquisite works of movement, dance, color, and story. There are pictures too suddenly present, even though I know they've been about us in this room, and I'm almost asking, but...
Because I'm just so glad you didn't see me earlier today.
Oh?
I had every dress out of my closet and decided I will be in purple and azure and buttercream and hunter vert and lots of flowing things, thanks to Cascade and Terry in my wake. Ladylike, I will have a scarf over something regal, regally worn regalia. I will not have a hat. I will show my head. I will show my hair. I will show myself, still myself, without additives, wigs, astringents, powders. I will regale all. I will do it with smiles and politenesses and breeding and memories, which will try to stop me from making too much fun of it. And which I already remember too much of too many things done different down there.
Down there?
Oh, seeing my brother in Virginia, which I hate going back to, but I want to be down there and see my brother. I just don't want all that baggage besides.
I know what you mean.
Well, I can say you are here safely, but back, you're not there yet, child. Not surprised, you know, the undiscussed always comes to whiplash us into retrospect.
The undiscussed?
Knit up in bougie breeding.
Bougie?
Oh, well, who other was that Negro child a few years ago dancing knives and creating unsolicited wonders in my kitchen?
Guilty.
And delicious. Mwah.
The undiscussed of bougie.
Informs performance from you in public, in front of all, especially in front of your own. The undiscussed always leads to the right spot, to know it inside, to know the weight of it, accept purpose of it, draw forward with that impetus as others collect in your stride and draw alongside. If never ahead, you are the difference in your own by that undiscussed but expected. That tension forever presses us into far too unexpected, much to ask about.
Rhea.
Yes, Rhea, encased. But you, no, you have room. You have sometimes self-protection, sometimes just is. Remember that, Ken, and understand why in such grace we can search along for those who know how to love and make you laugh, bring you peace of mind and heart. and being able to look more closely. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I feel you do. Well, and now, as ever you need tea and always to breathe, come up to the terrace, see the season's flowers, my abundant high place garden, which gives me such natural room to grace and sachet.
A restaurant.
Only in a phone call this morning is it spoken that my father is not joining, though this arranged brunch is still presided over by his second wife. Her sister Celia is here too. I know that look.
Take notes, think fodder, write later.
Because my father is omnipresent.
You know, until me, your father voted Republican.
He,
That's 100 years ago, Rhea. They were all voting Republican then. It wasn't until after FDR.
I wasn't married to my husband 100 years ago, Celia.
I'm not talking about when you married.
What I'm saying, Celia,
I know what you're saying, Rhea. I know that. I'm saying about African Americans all voted Republican back then. It's just what they did.
one fraction out of sync, I noticed that both these women do not say we, but they, as if such are not them.
Wine.
a Pinot Grigio.
I doubt it's a Pinot Grigio.
A large glass of white, please. What I'm saying.
No Pinot Grigio. I heard him, Celia. I heard. Is there a Sauvignon Blanc?
That isn't on the table, Rhea. Get a hearing aid. There's no shame in it. I have one. Matter of fact, I
Just white wine, please.
need to get another.
Just any white wine,
It's old now.
please.
What I wanted to say,
Celia, I know what you wanted to say.
they all voted.
Republican. Was that out loud?
My husband, Ken Jr.'s father.
Oh, for.
Celia.
Just say it. Say it. Kenneth. There, that's your husband's name.
I show respect, Celia.
Oh, so do I, when it's appropriate. If I'm in circles I'm not familiar with, I refer to Marrier as Dr. Caraway. It's how he's known professionally. But otherwise, why would I refer to him as my husband, Dr. Caraway, with folks who know him, with family? The man is your husband, and I know him. We all know him. You're always being so distant.
I don't mean to be distant. I just,
Don't want to be ordinary and capable of speaking to just other human beings? Yes, I know. We all know.
I'm sorry Mr. Johnson couldn't make it.
thank you.
Is he?
He's fine.
He can't be that fine, Rhea. He's not here. And I know you don't mean he didn't want to come.
Some mornings are better than others. You understand that, Celia, having Marrier at home,
And where else would he be?
needing the care.
At home. We have him here in our hearts. We always.
That where you were.
The women's policy
Women for women something.
borrow.
But it's what? For what?
Think tank. Family paid leave. Gender pay. Politics of parity.
And women of color. You have women of color there too.
Yes, though
There are no excuses for not.
I'm not making an excuse. Women of color who have a PhD have more choice in making a great deal more money than working at a not-for-profit.
So you really don't have any.
We have...
Not good enough.
Those who've made a good choice, making an impact.
And that's just not good enough. You need to do more. Do everything. Investigate. Where do you look?
PhD students in economics who...
Just economics. Just economics. Why not in every...
It's about economic policy making in state governments and now in federal.
Not good enough.
Rhea, let the man speak.
You should be doing more, everything to reach these young women of color who.
To clarify, they are women of color, or do you mean to speak to
Black women, yes.
or so not women of color generally, just specific color?
Black women, African American women, marginalized, always left out of consideration
Not
for.
what he said.
That's not what he said, Rhea.
I know what he said. I heard what he said. And I'm saying.
It's not enough. It's not enough. You're right. But it's what can be done in the field of expertise. And with the guidance from our board.
That has no people of.
Black.
It does. Yes. African Americans.
Then why?
Can you let him finish his sentence, please?
You will never know what it's like to be Black. Never know. To constantly be fighting racism and ever really know. I am the child of Black activists. You understand?
Children. We are the children.
Our parents lived in an era of uplift and Black leadership. They knew the great activist W.E.B. Du Bois. Do you know who he is?
I do.
He knew our parents.
Knew our family very well.
Was in a relationship with.
Celia.
Well, he was. He loved Daddy's sister. They were having an affair.
Not affair. He loved her.
But he was married. That's an affair.
A Black activist is what I'm saying. I won't make any excuses for that. It's how I feel.
You know, the PhD.
How I've always felt in dealing with this country's systemic injustices, racism, systemic.
I know how difficult. Into doctorate programs and make the most of it once you're done.
Celia.
Well, I do. It is difficult.
I didn't say it wasn't.
And it wasn't my choice. It was difficult. And I had married.
Yes.
And really,
that was your choice.
I didn't see how it was going to do anything for me anyway. I wasn't going to be in some high-flying world of finance or law like Daddy. I'm married.
Life doesn't stop just because you're married, Celia. My husband,
Kenneth, whom I know,
supported me all during the course of gaining my PhD.
We all know your husband's a saint, Rhea.
To flex my train of thought, and in front of me is a moment of last night. A fingertip touches the body of a tumbler of wine on my chest as the boho wistfully beneath the cover beside me actually suggests this brunch would be okay.
It's passed down. That's what they do.
Wait.
That's what white people do.
What?
In families, so that. What?
Well, you see my bow, right? White. Right there, my bow.
This has nothing to do with.
We don't mean Alan.
Alan, this has nothing to do with.
You are insane.
I don't see.
No, how's this? If I told you going to Alan's folks that all they did was talk about what blacks did, but insist, oh, we don't mean you, Ken. Tell me you wouldn't call that racist. You're going to sit there and tell me that not be racist of them?
Ken Jr.?
It would be racist of them. So how is it less so or not so coming from your mouth?
Rhea, you just always.
In this hot heartbeat of this instant, my father's second wife's face is a mask of imperturbable impasse, rigid, stare, retracts haunted into glaze, at the sight of her sister standing, looking down at her.
Mary, I'm gonna have to home now. Uber.
We can help you outside.
Thank you. Both of you. You know, it's all nothing more than Rhea's same old bullshit. Tangling everything up in all her bullshit. I'm sorry, Alan. You know where...
someone said something, and I was a little girl coming down the stairs, maybe from my room, but coming down, just sat on the stairs. My fair sister looking over the railing down at me, then came down a few steps and continued down, and in passing me, I remember this so vividly, said, "Why can't you get along with us? Is that why nobody likes you? Maybe because you're colored and we're white." Said that to me as she passed down the stairs to go out of the house. I was 8. My big fair sister was 10. Those words left me with a realization of why I really didn't feel like I belonged to them. I was not one of them. I was darker. Suddenly, understanding of my skin. They weren't as dark. Left only wondering, what was wrong with me?
All right, welcome back. Thank you all for staying and watching those 2 scenes of Tom Mentor's play by me. And now we're going to move the conversation forward. We would love to talk about how we scaffold audience spaces for experiencing theater of trauma safely. And Tom, I guess I wanted to understand from you what you consider to be theater of trauma. How do you define that? And same for you, Anthony. So I'm curious about, just for those who don't know what we're referring to or what we're talking about when we say that, what do we mean by that?
In particular, I mean that last scene that everybody has just seen, which is the brunch scene, where all of the secrets sort of like explode at the table. And we get the dimensions of the construct and layers of personal trauma for many people at that table, but especially the character of Rhea, where she has a remembrance that has come out of her own childhood that she had blocked. In the last number, I think in the last year and a half across pandemic, looking at the kinds of theater that we're talking about and we're bringing to platform, more often we have situations of dynamic family trauma or systemic injustice that leads to trauma, or some sort of trauma that is not only on stage, but then happens and spills out into the audience for having seen what's just on stage. And it's just made me recognize that we are in a period of such dynamic discomfort and change that our storytellers and our theater are going to be full of theater of trauma for the next generation, at least. And that's not funny. I mean, it's the truth. And I wonder how theaters are looking at this. Are they talking about this? I mean, they may sense it, but is there an understanding that there needs to be some active intentionality around scaffolding audience space in an afterward of the trauma, instead of just putting stools out on a stage and saying, how was that? What did you think? Wasn't that amazing? Or looking for the sensational to leave people with. Across pandemic hiatus, when we were doing the workshops for this play, I really came to understand how traumatizing, especially for audiences of color, this play could be, because it's showing how the undiscussed works in families of color. And that may be a perspective, a specific kind of nuanced perspective that they hadn't seen presented before, but in seeing it could articulate suddenly dynamics at family table and dinners and things that had happened to them in their own family, which is traumatizing. And so it became out of this journey the concern, if I want to have a talk back with an audience who has seen this, and they're people of color, even if not, but people who have been traumatized by the material, how do I get an audience to be comfortable in a space of diversity to talk about things that they've never talked about before, if not amongst themselves, certainly not about family, and certainly not cross color. This was all happening during pandemic hiatus. And so some of the conversations happened in a hybrid space that was unnatural, because it had this quality of individual comfort, because people were watching out of their own homes and spaces that were very much informed by them, so that there was safety there. But in bringing this into a theater and bringing this into a live space where we're going to present real people on stage, presenting real trauma and living it in the moment for audiences who may connect to that and be traumatized by it. How do we make sure that they're okay to unpack that? And what skills do we need to best address that? What skills and what resources should theater companies and arts entities in general bring to plays in scaffolding productions and education components that align with this new perception and understanding that we're traumatizing our audience and still wanting them to tell us about it?
That's deep. That's real deep. I'm wondering, even before the audience conversation, for you, Angelisa, as a director, you've directed a lot of plays that cover traumatic topics. I mean, you've directed one of my plays that covers a traumatic event as well. And I'm wondering what skills you employ to care for the audience while the action is on stage. I'd love to have that conversation first, and then to bring it to the post-show conversation. So yeah, for you, Angelisa, as a director, how do you approach those sorts of work?
Unfortunately, I will say that beyond the traditional kind of, way of describing a play's summary on a website, or, a director's note in a program that most people are not going to read before the show starts anyway, there really hasn't been a lot of or scaffolding on the before side of a show that that I've even ever had the opportunity to do, really. Now, within the rehearsal room, there's been a lot of, from my standpoint, I like to allow a lot of freedom for discussion. So if something comes up for an actor, to be able to say, we have the time to talk about what it is you feel you need to talk about, since they are kind of living it, through their performance. So from that standpoint, and then if there, is some type of advanced care that cannot be handled only in the rehearsal room, then, we talk with the theater about getting some other sort of support, to be made available for them. Post-show, I really do feel like the people who tend to stay after a show for some sort of post-show discussion typically are not the people who are traumatized. Typically are not the people who are I hate to use the word triggered, but where something inside of them has been touched in a very specific way. My experience has been that those people tend to flee, and so then it will be a matter of how to kind of recapture them. But my experience has also been that the people that tend to stay for a post-show discussion are the ones who are a bit more distant from the experience, who are able to look at the themes and look at the work as a piece of thought-provoking entertainment, but not necessarily a deep personal kind of experience being had by them in the theater. So I think the big question then for theaters is, once the person leaves the theater, how can we either recapture them to be able to share, or at the very least point them in the direction of possible resources, you know, for them to be able to feel comfortable sharing. I think a lot of people tend to go with friends, and so immediately after they go outside, they start talking with their, you know, whoever they came to the show with about the experience. And I guess they feel safe with those people versus a group of strangers. Yeah, but it's hard because for a lot of people, once the show ends, that's kind of the end of their engagement until the next time they walk through the doors again, you know. So it is a very kind of difficult thing to do. And I think one of the ways that a theater can begin to try to solve that problem is to somehow create some sense of community among the audience members that goes beyond just being in the theater at that one particular show, you know. But a lot of theaters don't have resources or bandwidth, you know, in terms of people and time to do the hard community building amongst their audience members to create that.
So many points there. That's so true. And I never thought about it that way, that audience members who are the most traumatized tend to leave first. And I've witnessed that firsthand. I remember seeing a play. I'm not going to name the play or the theater that I saw it in, but it was very traumatic. And lynching was reenacted on stage. And there was a Black couple who were old enough to be my parents who got up and walked out immediately after that. And me and the person who I went with stayed. But for me, what I needed was to speak to the actor who was on stage to find out what was that experience like for you. But that's actor me speaking to a fellow actor. But for those folks who may not be theater people, what happens after that? And that always stood out to me, that, wait, nobody's gonna go get them. They just leave and that's it, you know? So yeah, my mind went to that. And something else that my mind went to in framing traumatic material for audience members that I've done at Young Playwrights Theater and through work that I've done outside too, with a theater company I was with called the Sarkey Project, was priming the audience for the conversation before. So encouraging folks to show up early and having activities for them before that kind of introduce them to the subject matter. So we've done like a poster board where folks can write a sticky note and add to it, like, what is something that your mother used to tell you when you were growing up? You know, just so that people's minds could start percolating on what the discussions are going to be on stage, so that they're better prepared. But still, you never know just what experience one has and what they're bringing into that theater space before they come. Yeah, I'm a fan of just getting audiences to write things down. But how do you capture that person who runs out? Yeah, what are your thoughts about that, Tom?
It was in the journey of this that I recognized, number one, that hurtful is the wrong word, but this was material that can raise specter for people who may then move further away from articulating anything in that moment and may leave stricken. I mean, not just leave, but leave stricken. And that's uncomfortable for me to instigate that kind of a thing. So it started the whole thought in my mind around, as we move this play forward, you know, what are the things that we need to ask for in the community and arts entities that we'll be dealing with that will give the audience best care at the end? I love the thought of the writing component in the beginning and at the end. But I also think, Angelisa, to your point about money, that many theaters don't have that kind of bandwidth or stretch to be able to do husbandry on a production, concept through months afterwards in care for cast or audience. I don't know if we need to develop a new model for future theater, but I do know that this conversation is important, and also is an aspect of what this play ought to be used for.
I was going to say, I think you brought up a good point too, Tom, about how some people are ready to talk on the spot and others, it takes time for them to marinate. And so even how do we provide opportunities for those who want the time to marinate to be able to share, where they want to take more time to think. And I think too that it's interesting because I think as artists, sometimes we think some things may traumatize people and they don't, but then there'll be something that we don't even think about, as being a potential source of trauma for somebody. And then they're the ones that they pick up on, that. So even then being able to allow for the breadth of discussion, as well as the depth of discussion and sharing that would need to happen for it to be effective care is difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, that we can have as much foresight as we want, but we can't predict how material is going to affect everyone who watches it. Yeah, I was thinking about just in this post George Floyd era, and post, we see white American theater, how a lot of theaters that are white led or white staffed have felt compelled to perform more works from the Black experience, and how there's a lot of conversation amongst Black artists that a lot of the works that are being selected are traumatic works or works that display our trauma. They're being put on stage for primarily white audiences, but with Black performers. And prior to the pandemic, there was a play I saw. Again, I'm not going to name the play or the theater, but prior to the performance, one of the actors had a panic attack and couldn't perform because of the stress of the material. And they were able to pull another actor in very quickly, and that person performed and did a great job. But I was left wondering what happens to that actor. This was the final performance. So was there any follow-up? Was there any sort of care? And I wonder about just who the decision makers are and if that has an impact. The decision makers on the administrative and on the production end, but the way this process is, I know myself as a producer, we're so focused on the end goal that the people aspect sometimes can get forgotten, even if one has the best of intentions. So I guess that's not a question, it's just a thought that came to mind as far as just the levels in which people can be affected by the work, even people who you think are okay. Like an actor who's went through an entire rehearsal process and production process, and it wasn't until this final show that the weight of that material got to them. Yeah, so I guess that's just a thought, not necessarily a question, but just something that came to mind. And I'm wondering, for you, Tom, as a playwright, in writing about traumatic material, how much, is there a conversation within yourself of how much material you put on stage or how much you make explicit in the play versus what you leave to be understood?
That's a good question. I have to confess that in writing this play, because it was so close to me, I was traumatized. I was traumatized enough in writing it because it did mine my own experience. And so in having to present this with characters that you can walk around and have a 360-degree view of, it required me to be in their bodies in different fashions to make them organic and real, which was traumatizing as it was my own family. I don't know that I have the answer. I like to write about complex characters. I don't know that I've ever written a piece that has the kind of energy and dynamic and nuance and opportunity for stepping into as this piece. So it's kind of new.
Yeah. It made me think of something a colleague of mine often says, Jared Schamberger. He often says to students, write from your scars, not your wounds. So as a playwright, if you're writing from the parts of yourself that have already kind of healed over, they're still there. Those experiences are still there, but they've had an opportunity to be covered over by new skin, you know, but like a wound is still bleeding, it's still affected. And if we're putting wounds on stage without the time that we've given ourselves to process that, then we're literally handing over a platter of this is my pain. There's been a lot more conversation in the past year or so amongst theater professionals, and I look at like American Theater Magazine, about intimacy coordination and the importance of intimacy coordinators for actors. And for those who aren't familiar with that role, an intimacy coordinator is basically a person who specializes in helping stage moments on stage that can be vulnerable for the actors, whether they be actors kissing on stage or having to simulate certain actions that can be sensitive. But they are also there as a support for the people on stage to say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. And also to guide, like, this is the way you can do this so that you don't actually have to touch this person in this way, but it looks like that to an audience. And I wonder if there's such a thing for audiences, like if there can be somebody who is on the outside who is able to view something from what an audience experience can be. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine, a play that I was working on producing pre-pandemic that got canceled. We had one trans woman of color who was in the cast, and the rest of the people who were in the cast were cisgendered. And this woman was triggered by something that happened in rehearsal and went to a mutual friend, and I was able to kind of work the situation out with our mutual friend who's also a trans woman of color. And one thing that my friend recommended is that, why don't you have someone who's an advocate for this actor, who's not part of the cast, but someone who's paid to be there, who just sits on the sidelines and is able to be the person that this actor can turn to and be like, hey, am I tripping? Is that offensive, or am I just being sensitive? Or, hey, this really bothers me. I don't feel comfortable saying this to the director. Can you point this out? And how much like harm could be mitigated just by having that third party who isn't just a friend who's being supportive to their person, but is actually a paid role on this production. And I thought that was such a novel idea and something that I plan on doing once I'm able to produce in person again. And I wonder, depending on what the subject of the play is, or the context of the play, or the characters on stage, if that's something that you all think would be helpful to employ that could help kind of mitigate harm that could come to an audience, or at least let the artists who are producing something understand the impact that could potentially happen.
I think I could see that being helpful. I guess one question I would have is, especially given the discussion that we've had about not necessarily knowing what the sources of trauma for people are when they come in, and being touched by some things that we may not feel like going in would be traumatic, and vice versa. I guess the question, because I love the idea of that in the rehearsal room, because there is much more of a kind of singular focus, particularly for the one person. So I'm wondering, how do we do that for a larger group of people where an individual is, I think it would need to be multiple people. You know, like it couldn't just be one person. It would need to be multiple people who would be available for audience members, I think, after, you know, a show. I think also it brings up the question too, even just about physical space for people to be, You know, so if someone is traumatized after a show, where can they actually go? Or even during a show, where can they actually go if they don't want to necessarily leave the entire facility? And if there is someone that they need to talk, if someone is available that they need to talk to, where can they actually go? And that kind of limits what certain theaters can do if they're renting a space somewhere, or performing in a non-traditional space. How do we even give the physical space for those kinds of experiences to happen? Yeah, I love that idea, though. It's almost similar, or at least it strikes me as being similar to like how schools will have grief counselors on hand if students want to, you know, talk to them after something traumatic happens, you know, at the school. Yeah.
Yeah. What were you gonna say, Tom?
No, I absolutely agree with Angelisa. And it does sound really good. And I too would wonder how we could apply it to a larger space, a larger live space. I mean, so many of the complexities now, the added layer is it will be in live space. I mean, we haven't been in live space for so long, and now we're thinking in different sort of tactical strategies in being in proximity to one another and sharing incredible things. There is one aspect of this that I really wanted to touch on, though, which is that in understanding that this is might be a particular trauma to audiences of color, most specifically, how do we find ways to allow for being in an audience of diversity to have that happen, to then expect a conversation afterwards in front of somebody of color who is otherness now? How do we navigate that? Because I think that it's an important aspect of being able to truly honor and unpack the work.
For sure. Yeah, it reminds me of at Young Playwrights Theater some years ago when we did anti-racism work within our staff. The consultants that we worked with did something that they called caucusing, where our staff was very much just Black folks, white folks. So it worked in that environment, but the Black facilitator would actually caucus with the Black people after we had a meeting all together and maybe something intense happened or it was time for a break, where the Black folks can go into a separate room and talk and process with one another. The white folks went with the white facilitator. That gets very complicated when it's an audience of varying identities, though. So I'm not necessarily proposing this, but I do think that there is something interesting about being able to speak about work in smaller groups. I found that audience members are more apt to talk and share if they're only tasked with speaking to 2 or 3 people as opposed to a whole audience. It's not like the mic is on you. I've been to a play at Woolly Mammoth Theater, this was years and years ago, where they did something similar, where it was after the show, they kind of divided folks into different rooms, into different rehearsal spaces. And we had conversations about the work then, and this was after the performance was already over. And I found that to be interesting, just a way that as collectively, one could kind of process. And even if you don't feel like talking, you hear what other people are saying about the work. And through that, it kind of helps you process your own feelings, that one doesn't necessarily have to be the one speaking to gain something from a conversation. But if that's built into the action of the play, where it's like, okay, we're actually not doing curtain call right now. We're going into this room and this is part of the performance. That doesn't work for every type of play. I don't know that that necessarily even works for your play, Tom, but that is a model that I've found interesting, being able to speak in smaller groups and not have a captive audience per se, but make it part of the experience of the evening. Yeah, what do you all think?
I like that idea. Again, I still think that those who are most traumatized will probably flee and not go to not necessarily go to a smaller room. I do think that there is value in when people are able to just be in presence with each other and hear a discussion, because sometimes someone is able to give language to a feeling that that other people there may be feeling the same thing, but just don't have the words to express it. So I do believe that even if someone is not necessarily talking, that it's definitely still valuable for them to be there. Yeah, and you're right, it doesn't necessarily work in terms of it being part of the performance. I think I know what play you're talking about, but yeah, not necessarily part of the performance. But again, even if the performance has a definitive end, how do you still encourage people to stay? Because I've done post-show discussions where even 5 minutes, people are out. You know, just a 5-minute transition to allow actors to get changed, to set up chairs, you know, and literally 95% of the audience leaves. So I don't know if that's a cultural thing in terms of our theatrical culture. Because I have heard of instances in, I'm trying to remember which country it was, that someone was telling me this. I think it may have been Ireland, where the culture was that after the show, everybody goes to the pub next door. And that's where all of these conversations happen, at the pub next door. You know, so even like, even if it's not physically in the theater building, is there a way to even do that in places where we can share food and drink, and it is less formal of an atmosphere?
I really love that idea. I really, really do. I think that so much happens around food and drink and standing around socializing, that it might be an accent to what's just been experienced as a way of coming down from what you've just experienced and marinating and being able to articulate it without necessarily forcing construct of how people gather in this space. You know, if they come with friends, and the friends, of course, will collect something to drink and something to eat, and they'll start talking, but that the conversations can somehow have some movement to them, so that people move into various other conversations and might have that. But I think that this also, I love the idea, but I think that this also, in terms of planning, goes back to bandwidth and cost. And at the end of the day, it's really a matter of trying to find the mechanism that is best balanced for the entity and production company and production, that is geared towards facilitating audiences at the end. If there's a commitment for that, I think trying to find that space at the end where people can just step out to and have a drink and a conversation just needs to be layered in. But I just love the idea of that.
I love that idea too. Yeah, I think in order for it to really happen, it has to be a line item in the budget. Just like
Right.
when budgets for props and lights and incidentals and all that, like I think audience care should be a line item. Like what you brought up a few minutes ago, Angelisa, about grief counselors and how they have them at school. Like I think that's something that could happen in theaters. And something else that comes to mind too is you know, during the pandemic, everything was virtual, and, you know, folks were watching theater on Zoom and streaming, and some theaters have maintained that, you know, now that the world is still continuing to open back up. But a lot of folks have looked at it like, oh, thank God that's over. And then everything's back to being in person. But there is a level of care that can be applied for audience members who just want to watch something in the comfort of their home without that feeling of being othered, you know? Being able to watch something and process it without knowing that people are watching you process the work, which is an experience I often have in theater, where after a show, someone will say, I was just watching your face the whole time. Like, okay, so I came as an audience member, but I'm part of the show now because I'm one of the few Black people in this room. And how that otherness makes it so that one can't fully feel comfortable even having a genuine experience of the work without knowing that eyes are on them. But how different can that be from the comfort of one's home? And if they're able to maybe chat with a grief counselor afterward. During, I think it was a TCG conference that I had gone to a couple of years ago, where they had it set up in such a way that in any of the sessions, if you ever had a problem or felt like you just needed someone to talk to, they actually had a counselor in a breakout room that you can request to go to and just speak to that person one-on-one and then come back. You know, because this was like a month after George Floyd had passed. Like, it was a heavy time. And that was a service that they offered that I thought, like, that, you know, you're paying for that person's time, paying them hourly, maybe they're around for 2-3 hours. That's worth it. Like, if that help, even if just one person checks that service out or speaks to that counselor, that's one less person who's leaving traumatized by this work, you know? So I encourage theaters to think outside the box of just how things were done before, and also just outside the box of budget, that sometimes things that seem astronomically expensive are nothing compared to what you paid for your set. And if we could pay for wood and paint and all those things, I think we could pay for a person to protect the mental health of audience members, or at least be an advocate for the audience in that way. Because then what feedback are theaters really getting? If they're only getting the congratulations and I love this place so much for the folks who stay for talkbacks, are they getting enough information to understand what to do the next time they present this sort of work? Or are they continuing a cycle of producing work that isolates others, you know, isolates the people, the very people who they want in those spaces and who they want to see these shows? Yeah, so any final thoughts?
Mine is thank you, Farah, for engaging in this conversation with just enough construct to allow us to share a really deepful and meaningful conversation on difficult conversational topics. I love where we've landed with regard to how we care in future for audiences, and that this can perhaps start a different kind of conversation with theater companies. But I think that also as creators and responsible for our own work, we need to initiate those conversations with the entities that agree to do our work. And so thank you for allowing me to have that.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you, Angelisa.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have any final words?
No, thank you to the both of you. It's been a great conversation.
Awesome. And more thank yous to the audience who stayed tuned into this conversation and who watched the excerpts of By Me by Tom Minter. We hope that you all enjoy the rest of the gathering and that you stay safe and healthy and well. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person one day. So take care. Bye-bye.